minute early. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me and holding out. I know it's probably been quite a long day, but I've just had a coffee, so you're going to have to deal with that. We're going to be talking about compliance, both making sure your device is compliant from a starting point, and then also how you can kind of check and ensure it maintains its compliance. So there's only really three things that are guaranteed in life, that your life's going to get harder. And so if you're developing devices and you're taking those devices to the global market, then the fact is that you're going to continue to run into an increasingly difficult regulatory framework. So my name's Kurt. I work for a company called UL. Specifically look after the commercial activities. Been doing it for about 10 years, helping clients to determine exactly what they need to do in order for them to take their products to the market. And the two areas where I've had most of my focus, or where my division of UL, which of course is a huge company, has had their focus, has been in consumer technology, and then in the later stage, medical devices. So how about this for a show of hands, a bit of crowd participation? Who here is working with consumer technology, developing it, trying to get it to the market? Excellent. Hopefully there'll be some good nuggets for you guys in here. And how about medical devices? Do we have anyone in here that's dealing with medical? We've got a bit of maybe it's medical, maybe it's not. You'd be surprised how many of my clients are on that road. Perfect. Well, I appreciate that. So very recently moved into a management role looking after the UK and Ireland, but prior to that was very much on the coalface, traveling around the UK, helping my clients to jump through the hoops that are necessary. So as I mentioned, what we want to talk about today, what you need to do to get into the main regions. Oftentimes we break those down into Europe, US and Canada, and then rest of world or global market access. Then how you stay on top of those requirements. Is the impetus on you? Does your certification partner need to help you with that? Etc. And then finally, some of the common pitfalls, some of the common misconceptions which I've run into through my career so far, and hopefully by sharing those with you and trying to uncover them, maybe it'll save you from tripping over the same things that I've tripped over and my clients have also tripped over. So we'll start by looking at market trends very briefly. Don't want to spend too much time on that. And then we'll look at what the key challenges are for manufacturers, how we normally would see a client or see a company bring their device through to market, a case study to really highlight the complexity and the different areas that normally you'd need to look at. Hopefully that brings it to life a little bit for yourselves. Europe, UK, US, Canada, as mentioned, as well as the rest of the world, and then those misconceptions, and hopefully a bit of time for Q&A. So market trends, this is a generic UL slide that we like to use to tell you how we are involved in everything, but hopefully it gives you a bit of an overview of the types of world, and of probably areas where you guys are working as well. 5G is something that, of course, is hot topic at the moment, and for me, with a focus in the medical device, and also the case study that we'll look at, the personal wellness and health monitoring devices that we're seeing coming through epitomize the complexity of the different regulatory environments because of the amount of tech that's put inside of them. So hopefully by using that, we're kind of covering quite a lot of bases in both the medical and IoT consumer space. Now, when I'm talking to my customers, what is it that they are most concerned about? What are they getting the most pressure from their boards, from their teams about? Firstly, what they need to do. So there's often quite a bit of a lack of clarity about the correct regulations that need to be applied. A lack of clarity about the budget. You know, compliance sometimes can feel like the gatekeepers at the end. You've put your device together, you've worked on your baby, you've made it perfect, it suits your clients exactly how it should. Sadly, some conversations about making sure it's right from a regulatory standpoint have been absent, and so now we've got to the end point, and this big horrible test house, this big horrible certifier is stopping you from being able to sell it and make some money. Of course, there's ways you can combat that, and we'll talk about it a little bit. Spiraling costs, because of that last stage non-compliance, sorry. So unforeseen issues, unforeseen costs of retesting, redesign, and then of course missing your market release date, which is a very real thing in terms of your competitors getting there first, stealing your slice of the cake, causing you some issues for your business. Now, if you're engaged with the compliance process, it typically looks a lot like this. So from the point of having your first idea to getting that first device onto the market, there's normally 5 stages we see clients going through. Sometimes they'll skip a stage if they're feeling extra confident. But ultimately, you're working out this is how we would typically advise our customers to approach it, or manufacturers to approach it, right? You're looking at your initial markets. You're trying to understand what regulations you'd apply. Now, we'd say there's not really an early stage enough for you to start having that conversation. But it might feel like you're being a little bit premature by engaging an external party. But actually, by defining this at the early stage and designing against it, you set yourself up well. You then look at the standards that apply to those regulations, and then make sure that you're applying those standards in the right way and those principles in the right way to ensure your device, at least on paper, before it comes to fruition, is going to be compliant. You then look at pre-compliance testing. Typically, that would take the form of going to an accredited lab, doing some EMC tests, you may well be familiar with this terminology, maybe some radio performance tests, maybe having a conversation with a safety engineer to determine whether you're on the right path or if there's any red flags that they already could identify at an earlier stage. Then your stage 4, full compliance testing. Hopefully it's a box-ticking exercise by this point, because of course you've uncovered any of the big problems at the pre-compliance stage. And then stage 5, which is where you take that evidence of compliance, you prepare it, you make it look pretty for depending on the regulator that you'd like to give it to, and then you submit it, safe in the knowledge that they're going to say, that's lovely, come on through, sell your device, make lots of money. Sadly, it never really runs like this. So what we see in reality, of course, is that people are jumping. Maybe they jump to stage 3, then they realize they need to go back to stage 1. Then we're at stage 4. Maybe we just go straight to stage 4 from the get-go and think, it's fine, it'll work all right. So in an ideal world, this is the way that we'd suggest you do that. And part of the reason for that is something we look at called the 1-10-100 rule, which I'm sure a few of you in here will be familiar with. The idea that the estimation is that it takes $1 to fix a problem during design, it would cost 10 to fix during development, and it would cost 100 to fix by the time you're getting ready to release your product. So the earlier you can start thinking about these things, the cheaper it is for your business, even though it may not feel like it if you're having to engage external parties. So here's our case study. Working quite a lot at the moment with wearable health devices. These guys tap dance between the world of consumer and medical. It's a little bit of a fraught environment, but the reality is that from a regulatory point of view, they are increasingly becoming recognized as medical devices, especially when they have a specific intended use or a specific medical condition which they're helping you to address, or helping your patient or your customer to address. And so I think this slide really, from my point of view, was just to highlight the different areas that any one product manufacturer may need to think about, and the depth of complexity that might be necessary in order to bring a device from inception of the idea right through to being ready for the global market, let's say. And again, it's a little bit medical heavy, but as you can see, there's still a lot of carryover in terms of the electrical medical safety, EMC and radio performance, specific absorption rate, any wireless logo verification, so making sure you're friends with the Bluetooth special interest group, for example, so that you can make sure you can use their technology, and others, Thread, Matter, which has quite recently come about in terms of that interoperability. So we look at the European requirements. What we see with the EU directives in general is an aim to harmonize the regulatory requirements for all of the countries that are part of the EU, so that you're not having to think about each individual country. You can get your CE mark and you can start selling. And that breaks down into 4 major directives, at least that I'm focused on. Of course, if you're working in the machinery world, or if you're in hazardous locations, things are a little bit different. But in terms of consumer and medical, you'd be looking at the low voltage directive, which typically, otherwise known as the LVD, which typically would apply to devices between 50 and 1,000 volts for alt current, or 75 and 1,500 for direct current. the EMC directive, which would be applied to any active electronic device, considering its emissions profile, so how much noise does it kick out into the rest of the world, or its immunity profile, which is how much noise can you fire at it without it malfunctioning. And every device is considered in this context when you're looking at EMC. The MDR, which came into force a few years ago for medical devices, that's the European-wide requirement. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And then the RED, which replaced the R and TTE some years ago now. Feels like ancient history, but it's still within my career so far. And that is the framework for radio equipment. The main question oftentimes when you're thinking about Europe is, can I self-certify? As in, can I just put a CE mark on my device? Or do I need to engage a notified body and give myself quite a bit more in terms of people checking my homework and a big step at the end of the process? From a radio point of view, it really depends on whether the manufacturer is fully meeting the standard and that standard is harmonized and published in the official journal, the OJ. And that's under the Radio Equipment Directive. So oftentimes, when we talk about the RED, in short, oftentimes it will depend on the technology you're using, how state-of-the-art is it? You know, the regulations managed to catch up. Have there been enough products that have gone through where we have an established standard? Or is it still in a draft stage, and do you need to involve a notified body to check what you've been doing to make sure that it's compliant? For the vast majority of people engaged with the hardware pioneers, I would say if you're integrating, you would be integrating a existing radio module, perhaps a pre-approved module. In that instance, as long as you're leveraging the existing CE certification, there's no need for you to talk to a notified body. As soon as you have your evidence of compliance, you can leverage that which you've taken from the manufacturer of the RF tech, along with your EMC and safety evidence, create your technical file, write your declaration of conformity, sign on the dotted line, and start selling. When it comes to the MDR and IVDR, it's a risk-based approach. So this is for medical devices specifically, if we focus in on that. So class 1 would be self-certification. So this would be a very low-risk type device, unless it has certain characteristics. So there's class 1 measurement or sterile or reusable, then you need to get a notified body involved. Anything above class 1, so class 2A, 2B, or class 3, would require you to involve a notified body. So there's an awful lot more notified body involvement from a medical point of view. And this has been an even more significant shift as we move away from the MDD and we move to the MDR. When it comes to maintaining compliance in the EU, really it's on the manufacturer. So in essence, the self-certification approach provides some flexibility to manufacturers because you're able to gather your evidence, create a declaration of conformity, not involve anybody else, and put your device on the market, if it's a low enough risk and all the other caveats that I've just mentioned. However, if the regulation changes, so there's a new version, or you update your device, then the onus is on you as the manufacturer to make sure that your device is as up to date as it should be. Whether that requires retesting or a rationalization or risk assessment to say, actually, no, we're fine, the changes we've made aren't impactful enough, then that's fine too. But ultimately, it's on the manufacturer to be keeping an eye on the changes, keeping an eye on the official journal, the standards updates, and making sure that as a business you're protected, and that person who signed on the dotted line can sleep easy and not worry about any liability that might be coming their way if anything went wrong. It's not the case for devices that are already on the market. You can imagine it would be quite difficult if every time a standard changed, you'd have to recall all of the devices that were compliant to the previous standard. So of course, if they're already on the market, you don't really need to think about that. And during the kind of RNTTE and RED transition, this idea of on the market was used quite liberally, for example, with devices being sold, put in warehouses so that they're technically on the market, but actually not reaching their final destination for some time afterwards, but still maintaining their compliance. We're quite past that now, but there tends to be a transition period. So, for example, here with the RNTTE to the red, it was a year. And then once that was fully withdrawn, every new device needed to be compliant to the red. One way to stay on top of this is the blue guide. So that's issued by the European Commission, can support with further reference to CE mark and manufacturing responsibilities with legislation and standards. Let's look at the UK. Of course, this slide wouldn't have existed a few years ago, but here we are. We've got consumer and IoT devices. Ultimately, the UK CA mark will be used for goods being placed on the market in Great Britain, so England, Wales, Scotland, and pretty much every device that previously would have had CE. Key dates here, UK CA can be used from January the 1st, 2021, and I think we've all started to see that or have all started to apply that. You know, if you're as sad as me, having been in compliance for long enough, when tech arrives at your house, before you boot it up, you're looking at the label. Well, UK CA started turning up. And the CE mark will continue to be accepted until January the 1st, 2023. I think that date is still valid. The reason I say that is because whilst I was looking at the slide deck this morning on the train into London, and I was checking my LinkedIn, with the medical world, things have changed over the weekend, which is quite exciting in the world of regulatory. You know, things often take a little bit longer. It's not like politics. Things move quite slowly in regulation. I mean, we don't, you know, rate standards tend to take longer to change than prime ministers, for example. So as you can see here, we've been given an extra year, which, to be honest with you, there was whispers of anyway, in terms of the industry, because there's not really enough UKCA authorized bodies in place to manage the number of devices or customers that are wanting to sell into the UK. And it's basically a very similar story in terms of Europe. Like, we've seen the same thing happen. I think something like 60 notified bodies, or maybe over 100, was reduced to 10 or 15. And the regulations increased. So more customers needed notified bodies, less notified bodies existed. It's been a bit of a mess, but in terms of it coming round in Europe, we're getting there. The UKCA have obviously seen what's been going on the continent, said, we'll put that off for another year. I think we're okay. Key thing here, though, is for medical devices, you've got to register them with the MHRA before they're placed on the market. And any manufacturer outside of the UK will now need to have a UK responsible person for all of their devices that are being put into the UK. So that's clearly something we've seen in different parts of the world, something we need to, if you're operating outside the UK, consider for selling into our great country. We then have the USA and the Canadian requirements. Now, it'd be very difficult for me to go into depth about all of these logos, so I'm not going to. I'm just going to talk very briefly about them. So the FCC on the top left here is the Federal Communications Commission, and it's matched by the Canadian ISED requirements. So this is looking at radio devices, wireless products in the 50 states and other US territories, and as well as Canada. Key thing here is in the event of a client using a module with an FCC ID installed with the grant conditions, a limited assessment against KDB 996-369 can be used to demonstrate compliance, and that would normally look at some limited spurious emissions tests and output power measurements. In terms of the FDA, again, it's risk-based. So you've got three classes. Class 1, general controls. That might be something like examination gloves or electric toothbrushes, electric bandages, low risk. The regulatory requirement is quite low. Class 2, general controls and special controls. So that would be devices like powered wheelchairs or intravenous kits. And then Class 3, general controls and pre-market approval. This is the highest risk. Be implantables, pacemakers, anything that could cause significant harm if it was to malfunction. So if Class 1 and 2 are not exempt, then a 510K will be required for marketing. Class 3 devices require pre-market approval, unless there's a device that was put on the market before 1976 or is substantially similar. In the case that it's substantially similar, then you can use what's called a 510K, and you leverage that predicate device in order for you to be able to enter the market. There's also something known as a de novo application. This is basically for any novel type device. So if we haven't got a predicate it's the first type of device that the FDA is seeing, then you're going to have to take this type of road. When it comes to the EMC requirements, which moves us back into the FCC and the ICED, they're worried more about the emissions profile of your device than the immunity. So in Europe, we like to look at both. With the US side, the focus is very much, if everything is emitting at a safe level, then probably it won't interfere with the other devices. So you look at things as intentional radiators and unintentional radiators. Now, when it comes to maintaining compliance in the US, it's a little different. So we mentioned earlier with Europe, the kind of main consensus is manufacturer's responsible. With the US, you're getting the FCC or Industry Canada or the FDA or Health Canada involved to certify your device, to give you an FCC ID, for example, to give you FDA clearance. As long as you keep the device the same, you should maintain compliance. You've had that third-party certification review it, so you're kind of in a safer spot, if you like. We also have different approaches to safety. So in Europe, you can use an informative report from an accredited test lab. That might be enough. So let's throw some standards out there for my regulatory heads. 62368, 61010, 60601. Hopefully you're not asleep after that short list. But these are the types of safety standards where they are harmonized globally, depending on the type of device. In Europe, you'd be fine having an informative report. However, if you're going globally, you may want to look at what's called the CB scheme, or indeed a UL or NRTL mark for North America. Now, what is the CB scheme? Shortly put, it's a group of countries that have come together and agreed that under certain test practices, and assuming that the components that are used within the device also hold the CB certification, that they will be happy to issue a certificate for that device that will then give you further access to the global market. So it holds a hell of a lot more weight than, say, an informative report, because it's had this third-party review by a certification office, and only approved CB test laboratories can issue that evidence of compliance. So if a client comes to me and says, I'd like to go to 20 countries, firstly I'd say, look, let's slow down and think about an approach that you want to take, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. But ultimately, if you wanted to hedge your bets in terms of being prepared for the global market, having a CB certificate would be one of the best ways for you to do that. Now, that has a validity period of 3 years. So again, it will hold weight for some time. The assumption is after 3 years that the device or the standard would have changed substantially enough that you probably need to think about getting the compliance reviewed. Might be a bit different in the medical world. You know, devices tend to change at a slower rate than, let's say, the consumer world, where we see sort of every 12 to 18 months a slimmed down version, something with new tech. One of your customers has decided that they want an extra feature added, and we're rushing up to get that added there. And also this is similar in part to the UL or NRTL or NERTL, I've heard it called as well, which, you know, that's something you may have heard. Nationally recognized test laboratory. So that is, when it comes to the UL mark, we wrote the standards as a non-for-profit part of our business, 120 years old, but there is other NRTLs available. Not that you'll hear me talking about them too much. Shortly put, we're looking at the US and the Canadian requirements there. Interestingly, with the UL mark, if you have your device certified to an older version of the standard, because part of holding a UL or an RTL mark is that you have manufacturing location inspections of that device. So we will, if we were to do that for a client, visit them 4 times a year at their manufacturing location. And we're not looking at your QMS or really your ways of manufacturing. What we care about is that the device that you brought to us all those years before is exactly the same as the device that's leaving your facility. So we'd be looking at the list of critical components within your safety report, making sure that all of those components have that traceability, hold their own certifications, and that's maintained. So that goes 2 ways in some respects. You know, it's a good way for you to stay on top of that and be confident. But of course, if you do make changes, and I'm sure if you guys are developing devices, the chip shortages, the issues with microprocessors that we've all been experiencing over the last couple of years for various reasons can cause quite a compliance burden. So it definitely opens doors in the US. And the reason for that is because there's an organization called OSHA, so Occupational Safety and Health Association. Now, OSHA have dictated that the best way to show that you're compliant against the NEC, which is the National Electrical Code, is to have an NRTL mark or UL mark. So they're nationally recognized by OSHA. And I'm going to talk to you about whether that's mandatory or voluntary in a couple of slides, because there's often a common misconception when you start thinking about the US market about whether, do I need a UL mark? Is that really what I'm going to require? So we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And then we have the small topic of the rest of the world. So we've put together this map, which, in some ways is insightful and in some ways is terrifying, because what it's doing is highlighting all of the different regulatory environments that you may run into depending on the type of technology that you have inside of your product. So if I can try to break this down in a simplistic way, we spoke earlier and we all got very excited about that list of standards which I told you about. Now, one of the good things about those standards is that they are harmonized at a global level. So whether you're in Europe, you've got all those national deviations globally, or you've got the US, the standard number stays the same. So CB would normally help you get into most markets from a consumer point of view. From a medical point of view, it might just be that first foot in the door. So you may have an environment where they say, come talk to us when you have CB. We're going to have a few other things that you need to think about when you come into our country from medical. So from a consumer point of view, safety can be approached in quite a consolidated way. Mostly testing could happen in the UK, and you'd be good for most of the world. Once you add radio technology to your device, that completely changes. So every country has their own flavor of what they would like you to do from a radio point of view. That can be as simple as, let's pick on some people. The Australians and the New Zealand, they're quite good in some respects. So they follow the CE. They want you to structure your paperwork slightly differently, but ultimately they're following the EN requirements, that's the European norms. And they want you to have boots on the ground. So you know how earlier we spoke about the UK responsible person? They want the same thing in Australia and New Zealand. In fact, they've been doing it way longer than us. I'm sure that we probably copied them or many others. So that would be something we consider as a kind of low effort activity if you're already getting your market access sorted in Europe. Now let's imagine that we've added cellular and Wi-Fi and we'd like to go to China. I'm going to get to the extremes immediately. Or Brazil, or Japan's not so bad, we can talk about that. They will decide that they want you to come to the coming country, repeat all of the testing under a unique set of tests that look very similar to maybe some other tests that are happening elsewhere in the world, but we'd like you to do them in our country. And it's going to cost you a fair amount of money and take you quite a lot of time. So you can see how the application of certain technologies and the markets that you'd like to go to can have quite a significant bearing on the number of months and the number of zeros that you can put on the end of your compliance activities. So typically what we're thinking is of supporting our clients through a tiered approach. And that's kind of the proving grounds of North America and Europe, if you like, and then a serious rationalization about where else in the world makes sense. Now, when we're talking about the global market access, it's very difficult to speak specifically, but I spoke to one of my experts back at the office and asked them to kind of put together a one-pager to think about kind of what you could potentially be aware of. I'm sure some of you are probably thinking about broaching some other countries outside of North America and Europe. Regulatory information may not be easy. The developing countries may not really know what they're doing, or they may not have a very clear way of doing things, especially with state-of-the-art technology. They may be putting it together while you're putting it together. As we said here, no safety or EMC requirement because of harmonization does not mean there's no radio or telecoms. Actually, probably the opposite. Countries can have issues with stability. Whether you want to get into that country. I remember feel bad actually for picking out, but I remember a story being shared with me about the South African approvals agency, ICASA, where they'd had a fire and all of the submissions had been lost. So after waiting for months on end, people had to wait to resubmit, and I'm pretty sure they were closed for a good number of months as well. So there's also another instance of another country which I won't name because I can't remember, and I also don't want to do them dirty like that, but there was someone who was shot in traffic who was in charge of the compliance activities, and the paperwork just kept building on the desk that no one arrived at. So you've got to realize that there's massive amounts of volatility. It can feel very safe and happy, and although we have our issues in the UK and in Europe, there's a much more human element to the kind of global market, depending on where you're looking to sell. And this is the type of paperwork which you would need to prepare. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but hopefully something that you can think about. A lot of this stuff you would have already gathered for Europe and the US. It's just that you may need to consolidate it in a slightly different way. Now, common misconceptions. We've mentioned earlier that I'll speak to my clients, or maybe new clients, and they'll say, we want to sell everywhere. We've got a list of 30 countries. Unfortunately, however hard you try, it's very difficult to prepare for the whole global market. So as I said, that tiered approach is something to consider. You know, what is driving you to these countries? Do you have the guaranteed return on investment to make it worthwhile? Does your board have the appetite to wait months on end for it to arrive whilst they're paying for it? These are the things we need to consider. One of my personal favorites, CE plus CE doesn't equal CE. This is something we run into quite a lot in the world of compliance. So I'll speak to companies who are developing a product. They've done their due diligence. They've developed devices using components that are all certified in their own right. They've put that into, they've gathered the test evidence together, they've put that in a technical file, they've put a CE mark on there, they sign their life away and they start selling. The reality is that device is not compliant. What you're looking at there is not taking into account potential interference or potential issues that may arise from putting components that have been individually addressed into an enclosure and then selling them. So it's very important to be quite rigorous in this effect, because the last thing you want is for you to not be the one to identify that. When it comes to UL and NRTL, we spoke briefly about that framework and how it exists. Now, it's market driven. It's not necessarily mandatory. So if you're selling your device into the US, for example, you're not going to have it stopped at customs because it doesn't have a UL mark on it. Ultimately, it will be the authority having jurisdiction in that state, in that industry, that will determine whether UL is a requirement. So for example, OSHA, they tend to govern public spaces, let's say schools or government buildings or hospitals. Now if OSHA are governing the environment that you'd like to sell your device into, then they're going to want, then probably the purchasing manager for that environment is going to want to see a UL mark on every device that goes into their facility. So I've seen instances myself where we go CB because we don't think UL is required, and then as soon as you arrive there, they say, but you've got the UL mark, right? No, didn't know that was a requirement. So oftentimes the conversations I'm having with my clients is, what are you hearing from your customers? What are your competitors doing? Have you been at a trade fair where you've been asked about the UL mark or the NRTL mark? These are pretty significant pointers towards maybe it being required. And if not, then maybe it's not. You know, we're not in the habit of trying to give you more than you need, and there's an investment involved. We're going to come and see you quite regularly. I know that might sound like a nice thing, but ultimately it's something that you have to weigh up in terms of the benefit versus cost. And then finally, in terms of common misconceptions I've seen, is the use of a pre-approved radio technology doesn't always completely remove the need for you to look at the radio performance of your device. So it does a lot of the heavy lifting, but say for example you installed the module in a way that wasn't determined in the grant conditions of its certification, or you attach an external antenna which wasn't listed in terms of the external antennas that the original module manufacturer said you needed to use. these are instances where we're not saying you need to redo every activity, but it would be prudent to consider doing some limited testing to make sure that that radio performance has been maintained. And so when we look at the common pitfalls, again, this is not exhaustive. I sent an email out to some of my highest performers across different parts of our business, as I knew they'd probably have. I'd like to give them an opportunity to vent. As you can imagine, some of them took up the opportunity wholeheartedly, but I've kind of distilled some of their comments back, and hopefully it can be helpful for you guys. We always think about samples being ready when we want to do testing, and from an EMC and wireless point of view, that's often what's really important. 80% of the activity is the testing itself and making sure it passes those tests. You could say 20% is maybe the review and the reporting. From a safety point of view, you could flip that on its head. So actually, 90% of the projects that I see get stuck and delays to market are not because of the samples, but actually because of the paperwork not being straightened out. So I think a lot of, especially in the medical world, so I think a lot of the time the paperwork is overlooked as we all rush to get the device working, but actually this is an area where we could benefit from spending more time, making sure we're clear on the requirements and focusing in there. We spoke about target markets. I'd like to sell to the world. Let's narrow that down. Let's make sure that you've got a clear understanding of what each of those markets requires and then take them on a step-by-step basis depending on which ones are going to give you the revenue to justify the next. Components being selected without consideration for the requirements of the end product. Now, say, for example, you develop a product and you want to take it to the European market, so you look for CE marking all over your components, and you get into the European market, and that's great, but the first time you go to a trade show, you get an order through for a huge amount that needs to go to the US, and now you need CB and you need UL. But if those components don't have CB and UL, it's not an easy transfer. You may need to do some redesign, may need to use some new components. So if there's a risk of that happening in the short term, then it's worth thinking about having those components, having those certifications from the start, or at least being prepared to redesign your device for new regions if you don't have the cash flow at that time to get those components in place. We've already seen that the US, Canadian, and Europe requirements are not wholly sufficient for the rest of the world by that lovely fetching map, which I scared you all with. And then, the specific requirements of a region rather than the full scope of the compliance requirements. So only covering EMC when actually there's a safety requirement, for example, or just not being fully aware of the full picture of what's needed for your type of device. And that's all, folks. So hopefully there's at least been a few kernels of helpful information in that talk. We do have a couple of minutes for question and answer. I don't know if anyone would like to ask a question. I'll do my best. Got a gentleman just over here. Oh, look at this. That's perfect.
Okay. Just a question. What is the difference between a product that is battery-driven and a product that maybe fits in a vehicle versus a product that connects to the mains?
In terms of what would need to be applied?
Low voltage directive is a good example.
So if you've got a device that's battery, it really will have a massive impact on most aspects of compliance. So power is the most safety critical aspect of any product. So from a safety point of view, if you're using a solely battery powered device versus a AC mains device, then it's going to reduce the scope of work that's going to be necessary for you to do. Although if you're getting, for example, the CB or UL, you'll need to be thinking about that battery also holding that certification. From an EMC point of view, there's surge and transient tests that would be applied to AC mains. That, of course, if you're using a battery-powered device, you could overlook or you could skip. So, and in terms of a vehicle, we move into the kind of VCA Regulation 10 space. I couldn't speak so much to what impact a battery would have, but oftentimes the regulations for a automotive would be depending on how it's connected to the car. So if it goes into the CAN bus, for example, if it has the opportunity to distract the driver. Oftentimes when a device is battery powered, maybe it goes into the 12 volts, but it doesn't have that same connection with the car that would necessarily mean that you need to go through the full VCA certification. Bit of a broad answer, but if you'd like me to, if there's anything more specific, we can always set up a conversation with one of the guys from a technical point of view. I appreciate that. Am I going to get away with no more questions? We've got 1 minute left. No. Please. We might get away without a mic. Or we can have a mic.
Hi. I wanted to ask regarding Class 2A medical device. So if I use, let's say, modules, right, that are pre-certified, compliant, or if I, on the other end, if I use chips that are not certified, right? What would be the difference? Because you still would have to go through certification, right?
Yeah.
But would it be any easier if I use modules that are pre-certified?
So great question. And actually, I've kind of just realized that I should have talked about this a bit more during the discussion. So when you have a medical device that also has wireless, you're now in the unenviable position of needing to be compliant against two regulatory environments. So you have the MDR for your Class 2A device as a medical device, which will be mostly unaffected by the decision you're talking about. So whether you use a chipset or you use a module, of course, in terms of its usability, its functionality, if it has wireless, you need to be considerate of that. But it's actually the radio equipment directive, which you'll also need to show compliance against, which would be affected by what you're talking about. And so under the red, by using a chipset, you'll need to look at the radio performance in some depth. There's three main areas, really: safety, EMC, and radio performance. By using a pre-approved module, hopefully you remove the need to do that third thing. So it would still have a big impact on your compliance in terms of cost, to the region of maybe 5 figures and weeks, depending on the technology that you're using. But as a medical device, that decision is not the one that will impact you the most.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I hope that's
can I
helpful.
just ask one more quick one?
Sure. I'm not in charge here, so we can just keep going. It's fine.
So, in case of a change in hardware, is there any type of a change that would not require a reapproval or a recertification? So, for example, if there's just a small change of tracing on a circuit board that doesn't affect in any way performance, would you still have to go through a whole certification process?
Really difficult to answer. The way that I handle this with my clients is we look at it on a case-by-case basis. So the communication remains open, and if you're considering a change, we just run it past us. As I mentioned earlier, the phrase safety critical components, if you change one of them, you're probably going to need to have a look at doing some pretty significant activities. The tracing on a PCB, well, a PCB itself is considered a pretty critical aspect of the device, so you probably need to do some limited EMC at a minimum. And it probably would need to be detailed depending on the level of certification from a safety point of view. It would have an impact on your cert. So you'd need to approach your chosen body, let's say, and check with them to see what their consideration is for that. Sadly, it's not a one-size-fits-all, that one. I think we're going to need to wrap up there. We can have a chat afterwards, though, absolutely. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.